If you have ever raised a child alone, while the whole world quietly bet against you, this story is going to feel like it was written about your life. Stay until the end, because what happens between a broke single father and the coldest CEO in the Sang city will remind you why you should never, ever, let anyone tell you that you are not enough. And if this story moves you even a little, hit that like button and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting for you. Daniel Carter had exactly $412 in his checking account, a 7-year-old daughter who believed in him more than he believed in himself, and a folding table full of centerpieces he did not want to arrange. He was 34 years old, built like a man who used to play college football and now spent his nights hauling drywall on job sites that never called him back for a second project. His architecture firm, the one he had built from nothing after his divorce, was 3 months behind on rent for a studio the size of a walk-in closet. Tonight, he was not an architect. Tonight, he was a warm body the event company hired at the last minute to set up tables at the Rain Industries Winter Gala, because the temp agency was short 2 people, and Daniel Carter had never once said no to a paycheck, no matter how small. The ballroom sat on the top floor of the Meridian Hotel, 40 stories above a city, glittering like it had spilled its own jewelry box across the ground. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline in gold and blue, and chandeliers the size of small cars hung from a ceiling painted like a storm cloud learning to be beautiful. Daniel adjusted a centerpiece of white orchids for the 3rd time, glancing at his phone every few minutes to check on his daughter, Lily, who was home with Mrs. Walvarez from next door. Probably still awake, probably still clutching Mr. Buttons, her stuffed rabbit with one ear, chewed soft from years of bedtime confessions. He did not notice the woman until she was standing directly across the table from him, adjusting the same orchids he had just fixed. "You have them backwards," she said, without looking up. "The tallest stems go toward the window, so the arrangement reads correctly from the room, not from the kitchen." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "With respect, ma'am, I did not realize centerpieces had a correct side." "Everything has a correct side," she said. "Most people just never bother to find it." That was when he actually looked at her. She wore a fitted ivory gown that moved like water when she shifted her weight. Dark hair swept into a low, severe bun that somehow made her look more powerful rather than less. And there was a coldness in her sharp emerald eyes that he recognized immediately, because he wore a version of it himself most days. It was the look of someone who had learned that softness got taken advantage of, so she had traded it in for something armored. "You work fast," he said, nodding at the flowers she had already rearranged without seeming to try. "You a florist?" "I own the building," she said simply, and walked away before he could figure out whether she was joking. He found out 20 minutes later, when the room hushed, and a man at a podium introduced Alexandra Rain, CEO of Rain Industries, the woman who had taken her father's failing shipping company and turned it into a real estate and logistics empire worth more than the gross domestic product of some small countries. Daniel nearly dropped a tray of champagne glasses. The woman correcting his flower arrangement was the reason 400 people in designer gowns and tuxedos were standing in that room at all. She found him again near the end of the night, when most of the guests had thinned out and he was folding tablecloths alone, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled to his forearms, looking every bit like a man who did not belong in a room that expensive. She had a glass of untouched champagne in one hand, and an expression he could not quite read. "You're not with the catering company," she said. It was not a question. "Temp work," he admitted. "I'm actually an architect, or I was. Business has been slow. Rain Industries is breaking ground on a community center in Ashcroft Park next spring," she said. "We have not selected a firm yet." "Is that an invitation?" "It's information," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting just slightly. "What you do with it is up to you." He studied her for a long moment. This woman who ran a billion-dollar company and still noticed when centerpieces were arranged wrong. who had traded champagne small talk to talk shop with a man in a rented tuxedo jacket that did not fit his shoulders. "You know," he said, unable to help himself, "with an eye like yours for detail, and standing there in that dress like you own the whole skyline, you'd make a great bride." He meant it as nothing more than a tired joke, the kind of thing a man says at the end of a 12-hour shift when his filter has worn thin. He expected her to walk away, or worse, to have him fired before morning. Instead, Alexandra Rain smiled, slow and unreadable, the first real smile he had seen on her all night. "I would need a groom for that," she said, and left him standing there, holding a folded tablecloth, his heart doing something it had not done in 3 years. He did not expect to see her again. Billionaires did not remember temp workers, and CEOs did not chase down men who folded their linens. But 6 days later, his phone rang with a number he did not recognize, and a crisp voice on the other end informed him that Rain Industries had reviewed portfolios from 11 architecture firms for the Ashcroft Park Community Center, and Carter Design Studio had made the shortlist of 3. He nearly dropped the phone. His daughter, doing homework at the kitchen table of their small 2-bedroom apartment, looked up at the sound of his laugh, the kind of laugh that had not left his chest in longer than he wanted to admit. "What happened, Daddy?" Lily asked, her curly pigtails bouncing as she tilted her head. "I think," he said, sitting down across from her, still stunned, "someone just gave us a chance." The pitch meeting was held on the top floor of the Rain Industries Tower, glass walls looking out over a city that seemed smaller from up there, like something you could hold in your palm. Daniel walked in with his portfolio under one arm, and his confidence held together with tape and prayer. Alexandra sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 4 board members, her expression giving nothing away. Professional in a way that made the woman from the gala feel like a stranger. He presented anyway. He talked about community centers not as buildings but as promises, about how the right design could tell a child from a broken home that somebody had thought about them on purpose, had built a reading nook by a window, because kids like his daughter needed a quiet place to feel safe. He watched the board members nod along politely, but he watched Alexandra, whose eyes had softened by degrees as he spoke, like she was hearing something underneath the architecture, something about a father who built things because it was the only language he had left to say, "I love you, and I am trying, and I am sorry." The divorce happened all at once. Carter Design Studio got the contract 3 days later. What followed was not supposed to become anything more than a working relationship, but proximity has a way of dissolving good intentions. Alexandra started showing up to site visits that did not strictly require her presence, standing at the edge of the lot in tailored blazers and sensible flats, asking sharp questions about load-bearing walls and sustainable materials that told him she had actually read every page of his proposal, not just skimmed the summary. Daniel found himself staying later than necessary, finding reasons to walk her through blueprints twice, memorizing the way she chewed the inside of her cheek when she was concentrating, and the way her guarded posture eased, just slightly, whenever Lily was mentioned. That happened first by accident. Daniel had to bring Lily to a site visit when his sitter canceled, expecting Alexandra to be irritated by the disruption to a serious business meeting. Instead, she crouched down to Lily's eye level in her $400 heels, asked Lily what Mr. Buttons's favorite color was, and spent the next 20 minutes listening to a 7-year-old explain, in exhaustive detail, the complete social hierarchy of her stuffed animal collection. Daniel watched from a distance, blueprints forgotten in his hand, and felt something shift permanently in his chest. Word of Alexandra's visit to the job site traveled fast through the small crew of contractors, and by the following week, half the site was placing quiet bets on how long it would take the CEO to fire the architect she was clearly, obviously, hopelessly falling for. Daniel ignored the teasing the way he ignored most things that threatened to embarrass him, by working harder and talking less. But even he could not deny that Alexandra Rain had started to feel less like a client and more like a fixed point in his week, that he oriented everything else around. He caught himself sketching the community centers, window seats with a particular slant of afternoon light in mind. The exact gold that fell across her face, the time she had stayed past sunset, reviewing structural drawings with him, the two of them hunched over a folding table with cold pizza between them, arguing companionably about whether the entry hall needed a skylight or whether that was, in her words, an unnecessary indulgence that would blow the budget by 6%. Everything doesn't have to be efficient, he told her that night, tapping his pencil against the corner of the blueprint. Sometimes a room just needs to make a kid feel like something good is about to happen to them. She had gone quiet at that, studying him with an expression he could not quite name yet. And 2 days later, the skylight was approved without further argument, buried in a line item, labeled natural lighting enhancement, that he suspected she had personally pushed through the budget committee herself. "You're good with her," he said later, once Lily had fallen asleep in the back seat of his truck during the drive back. "I had a father who was never home," Alexandra said quietly, looking out the window instead of at him. "I promised myself that if I ever had children, I would actually show up. I just never expected the company to eat every hour I had left to give." "You could still give some of them away," Daniel said. "The hours, to the right person." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time since the gala, the armor slipped enough to let something warmer through. "Careful, Mr. Carter. That almost sounded like a proposal." "Not yet," he said, smiling despite himself. "But I'm working up to it." Their relationship grew in the in-between spaces of a construction project, over coffee at 6 in the morning, before site crews arrived, over late-night phone calls, disguised as budget discussions that lasted 2 hours, and mentioned budgets for maybe 10 Mac, 1 minutes of it. Alexandra began attending Lily's school events, sitting in the back of the auditorium during the winter recital, clapping loudest of anyone when Lily forgot her lines and improvised anyway. She brought Lily books about female engineers and architects, inscribed with notes that said things like, "You can build anything you want," and she meant it in a way that made Daniel's throat tight every time he found one on his daughter's nightstand. For the first time since his divorce, Daniel let himself believe that his small, broken family had room to grow into something whole again. It was not all smooth. Daniel's ex-wife, Sarah, resurfaced that winter after 18 months of near silence, calling to say she wanted more time with Lily, now that she had, in her words, gotten her life together. Daniel spent an entire weekend, braced for a custody fight he could not afford to lose, and definitely could not afford to litigate, staring at old text messages where Sarah had once told him that ambition mattered more than affection, that she needed a husband who was going somewhere, not a man content to build small things for small people. When he finally told Alexandra about it, bracing for pity, or worse, for her to quietly reconsider whether his complicated life was worth the tabloid risk, she surprised him by showing up the next morning with the name of a family attorney she trusted, personally, and by simply saying, "You are not doing this alone. Not the custody, not any of it. You don't have to fix my problems," he said. "I'm not fixing them," she answered. "I'm just refusing to watch you carry something heavy by yourself when I have 2 free hands." It was such a small sentence, and it undid him more than any grand declaration could have. The custody scare passed within a month, Sarah's renewed interest fading as quickly as it had appeared, but it left something behind in Daniel that felt suspiciously like hope, the dangerous, fragile kind he had sworn off after his divorce. He began to let himself imagine an actual future, instead of just surviving the present one. Dinners that were not rushed, a house with a yard for Lily, evenings that did not end the moment the day's crisis was handled. He began, quietly and without telling anyone, to imagine Alexandra Rain in all of it. Then the article ran. It was a gossip column at first, nothing serious. A blurry photo of Daniel and Alexandra at a Dance Drive coffee shop, with the headline, "Billion-dollar CEO slumming it with broke single dad." The story picked up traction, because the internet loves nothing more than tearing down a woman. for daring to want something outside a spreadsheet. Within 2 days, it had migrated from gossip blogs to business news, reframed as a question about whether Alexandra Rain's judgment was compromised, whether a relationship with a financially unstable contractor, currently under agreement with her own company, constituted a conflict of interest that could tank investor confidence. The Rain Industries board called an emergency meeting. Daniel was not invited, but he heard about it from Alexandra that night, her voice flat over the phone, in a way that scared him more than yelling would have. "They want me to end the community center contract with your firm," she said. "Reassign it, quietly, before the story gets bigger. They're saying the optics of continuing to work with you while we're, whatever we are, could hurt the stock price ahead of the merger with Holloway Group." "And what did you tell them?" There was a long silence. "I told them I would think about it." That silence broke something in him that he did not know was still breakable. "Alexandra, I've been thrown away by people who thought I wasn't enough my entire life. My ex-wife left because she said I'd never be the kind of successful she wanted. I built a whole company out of the wreckage of that. I am not going to sit here and let you think about whether I'm worth protecting. That's not fair," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "You don't understand what's at stake for me. Everything I've built." "I understand exactly what's at stake," he said quietly. "It's just that my daughter and I have never been anyone's priority when it mattered. I thought this time was different." He hung up before she could answer, and for 3 weeks, neither of them called. Daniel threw himself back into the drywall jobs and the temp shifts, telling himself it was better this way, that he had been foolish to think a woman like Alexandra Rain, with her glass tower and her board meetings and her father's legacy resting on her shoulders, could ever choose a life that included second-hand furniture and school pickup lines, and a man who counted grocery coupons at the kitchen table. He stopped checking his phone for her name. He told himself it did not hurt as much as it did. He picked up every temp shift he could find, filled his evenings with drywall dust and overtime pay, and told himself repeatedly that this was simply proof of what he had always known, that men like him built things for people like Alexandra Rain, but were never meant to actually stand beside all them at the ribbon cutting. He avoided driving past the community center site, taking the long way to Lily's, to school, even though it cost him 15 extra minutes every morning, because he could not bear to see the skylight going in without her standing beneath it. Alexandra, for her part, did not fare much better. She sat through merger negotiations she no longer cared about, approved marketing decks she barely read, and found herself staring out her glass office, windows at the skyline she had once been so proud to own, wondering when exactly she had let a room full of men in gray suits convince her that a good man, love, was something to be weighed against a stock price. Her assistant noted, though never said aloud, that the CEO, who used to leave the office at 6, some evenings now stayed until midnight most nights, as if outworking the silence in her apartment might make it hurt less. Lily noticed anyway. Children always notice. "You're sad," she told him one evening, climbing into his lap while he stared at nothing in particular, a mug of cold coffee forgotten on the counter. "Is it because of Miss Alexandra? It's complicated, baby. She gave me a book that said I can build anything I want," Lily said, frowning with the particular seriousness only 7-year-olds can summon. "I think you should build this. Even if it's hard. You always tell me hard things are worth building." Daniel closed his eyes, his daughter's small arms around his neck, and did not have an answer for her, because she had just repeated his own words back to him with more courage than he currently had. What he did not know was that Lily, 3 days later, asked Mrs. Alvarez for a stamp and an envelope, and with careful, uneven 7-year-old handwriting, wrote a letter and mailed it to the Rain Industries Tower, addressed simply to Miss Alexandra, CEO, the tall building with the pretty windows. Alexandra's assistant almost threw it away as fan mail. She did not, and 3 days after that, it landed on Alexandra's desk during a board meeting about the Holloway merger, right as the Meadstead executives were finalizing language to formally end the community center contract with Carter Design Studio. The letter was 4 sentences long. My daddy builds things because he loves people. He built the reading corner for kids like me. You said I could build anything I want. I think you should build us too. Because we already started, and it would be sad to stop. Alexandra read it twice at the head of that boardroom table, surrounded by men in gray suits discussing stock prices and public perception. And something inside her, something she had spent 15 years locking down in the name of legacy and control, finally broke open. She stood up in the middle of the meeting. "We're not ending the contract," she said. "And if the board has a problem with my personal life, you can take it up with our attorneys, because I did not spend 15 years rebuilding this company, just to let it teach me that love is a liability." She walked out of that boardroom, got into her car, and drove straight to Daniel's job site, where he was standing on a half-finished second floor of the community center, framing timber against a gray winter sky, unaware that anything had changed. She climbed the temporary stairs in heels that were absolutely not meant for scaffolding, and when he turned and saw her standing there, wind-blown and out of breath, and more unguarded than he had ever seen her, he set down his level and just waited. "Your daughter wrote me a letter," Alexandra said. "She said we already started building something, and it would be sad to stop." "She didn't tell me that," Daniel said, something cracking open in his chest. "I told the board that love is not a liability," Alexandra said, closing the distance between them. "I told them I would rather lose the merger than lose you. I have spent my entire life being told that the correct side of everything faces the room, faces the optics, faces what looks right to everyone else. I don't want the correct side anymore, Daniel. I want the true one." He reached for her hands, rough carpenter's hands against her manicured ones, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, just stood on unfinished floorboards, 40 feet above a city that had spent 3 weeks trying to convince them they did not belong together. "You once told me you'd need a groom," he said finally, his voice rough. "I've been thinking about that for weeks. Is that a proposal, Mr. Carter?" "Not yet," he said, echoing himself from months before, a smile breaking across his face for the first time in weeks. "But I'm finally ready to work up to it properly." The community center opened the following spring, with a reading nook by a window, exactly like the one in his original pitch. Sunlight pouring across small chairs, built low enough for children to feel like the world had been sized just for Nepidar. Alexandra stood at the ribbon cutting in a simple navy dress, no board members flanking her. Just Daniel on one side and Lily on the other. Mr. Buttons tucked under the little girl's arm for the occasion. 6 months later, Daniel proposed on that same unfinished turned finished second floor, where the framing timber had become a sunlit reading room, where the correct side of every window now faced the people who mattered instead of the people who were watching. Alexandra said yes before he even finished the sentence, and Lily, standing nearby with a video camera she had absolutely no idea how to use, screamed loud enough that the whole building probably heard her. They married in the community center itself the following autumn. String lights instead of chandeliers, folding chairs instead of gilded ones, and vows that mentioned nothing about mergers or stock prices, and everything about showing up, about choosing the true side over the correct one, about a joke at a gala that turned out to be the truest thing either of them had ever said. Lily walked down the aisle first, scattering flower petals from a basket with the ferocious concentration only a 7-year-old, given an important job, can summon. Mr. Buttons peeking out from the crook of her elbow because, as she informed everyone loudly beforehand, he refused to miss the wedding after everything he had personally gone through to help make it happen. Mrs. Alvarez sat in the front row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue she had brought specifically for the occasion, and even some of the same board members who had once argued for ending the community center contract stood near the back, having been quietly won over months earlier when Alexandra invited them to see, in person, exactly what love had built while they were busy worrying about optics. Daniel stood at the front in a suit that actually fit his shoulders this time, watching the woman who once corrected his flower arrangements, walked toward him in a dress far simpler than anything she had worn to a single gala in her life, because she had told her stylist she wanted to look like herself, not like a headline. When she reached him, she leaned in before the officiant could even begin, and whispered, "Just for him. You were right. The tallest stems do not always need to face the window." "No," he agreed, laughing despite the tears threatening at the corner of his eyes. "Sometimes they just need to face home." Their vows were short, unpolished, occasionally interrupted by Lily's enthusiastic narration from the front row, and entirely, unmistakably real. Alexandra promised to keep learning which side of things actually mattered. Daniel promised to keep building rooms, and a family, and a life, one honest board at a time. When the officiant finally pronounced them married, the whole community center erupted into the kind of noise no gala ballroom, however grand, had ever earned. A year later, the reading nook by the window had become Lily's favorite place in the world, a spot where she did her homework most afternoons, while her father sketched new projects at a nearby table, and her stepmother, still occasionally referred to in company memos as the CEO who insisted on natural lighting enhancements, worked remotely on her laptop just to be near them both. Rain Industries eventually completed the Holloway merger anyway, on terms Alexandra negotiated personally, terms that included funding for 3 more community centers across the city, each one required by contract to include, in the architect's own specific words, a reading nook built low enough for a child to feel like the world had been sized just for them. People in the neighborhood still tell the story a little differently, depending on who is talking. The contractors on the original crew swear they knew from day one, from the moment the CEO climbed scaffolding in 4-inch heels, just to argue about a skylight. Mrs. Alvarez insists it was Lily who did all the real work, a claim Lily herself has never once denied. And Alexandra, when reporters ask about the merger that made headlines for entirely different reasons than anyone expected, simply says that the best decision Rain Industries ever made was letting a broke architect with tired eyes talk about what a room could mean to a child who needed to feel safe in it. Daniel, for his part, has framed the letter Lily wrote, the 4 uneven sentences that changed the direction of 3 lives at once, and it hangs now in the reading nook itself, at exactly the height a 7-year-old can read it, without having to look up. If there is one thing this story wants you to remember, it is this: the people who truly see you will never make you shrink to fit inside somebody else's tough idea of what you deserve. Sometimes the best things in life do not arrive dressed as opportunities. Sometimes they arrive folding tablecloths at the end of a long night, tired and unimpressive, and completely unaware that they are about to change everything. Do not let anyone, not a boardroom, not a bank account, not a headline, convince you that you are not enough to be somebody's whole world. If this story touched you, do not forget to like it, subscribe for more, and tell someone in the comments below who they would build a reading nook for, because love, real love, is always worth the building.